Rethinking the interaction hypothesis. A distinct feature of interaction hypothesis has been that it has been reformulated over time. As new research started to pour in regarding the role of interaction in second language acquisition, in the light of the findings, Long also reformulated his hypothesis. And as we discussed before, the second language researchers now simply did not just describe the type of input or that came to the learners during different interactions, but they also started to now discuss how was this input or how was this interactional input related to the development of their second language acquisition. And this is evident in Long's reformulation of his own hypothesis. So Long's new hypothesis places more emphasis on linking the features of input and linguistic environment. And they started to look at now how the environment around the learners provided them with what sort of input and how did this input actually relate to the learner's cognitive processes. So this was a substantial move from just describing what type of input was available to different learners during interactions. This newly formulated hypothesis also places more emphasis on explaining how do these linkages between linguistic input that comes from the environment, the language processing that takes place in the mind of the learners, how does it lead to actually the goal of language development or the second language development, which was the goal of the researchers. Interestingly, this research also highlights the role of negative evidence. Now remember, we discussed that negative evidence is any sort of feedback that allows the learners to know that they need to readjust their language or their language structure or item they are using is incorrect. This can be directly given to the learners, like we do as teachers in our classroom situations, or this can be indirect in the shape of a recast. And we will discuss what recasts are in a minute. So it was highlighted in the research under this hypothesis that the learners learned a lot or improved their language if some sort of negative feedback was or evidence was given to them regarding their use of the language, especially related to the structure of the language itself. Secondly, another important highlight of this reformulated hypothesis was that it was assumed that the learners actually do not pay attention to all the input that takes place, that comes to them during an interaction, but that their attention is selective, depending on their age, depending on their interest, or other contextual features. They focus on some aspects of interaction. That means even when you are giving some feedback to your children in your classroom, for instance, to learn English language or Urdu language, they will pay attention to only selective parts of that feedback. And not all the input that you give to them in the form of negative evidence or corrective feedback will be taken up by the learner as an intake. When we say something that becomes an intake means when the learners actually reformulate their language structures and make the correction in their language for good. So that is known as intake. When we give some sort of feedback, that is seen as input.